The first time I realized something was off about the neighborhood wasn't when we saw the endless line of cookie-cutter houses or the perfectly symmetrical lawns. It was the way people paused when my wife pulled her black SUV into our own driveway. We'd barely unloaded the first box when a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and an aggressive ponytail strutted across the street like she owned the concrete beneath her feet. "Excuse me," she called out, pointing at my wife's government-issued vehicle. "You can't park that here. This is a residential neighborhood, not a federal depot." My wife, who had just come off an overnight shift assisting in an international cybercrime bust, looked at her in disbelief. "This is our home," she replied coolly, gesturing to the deed paperwork still in her hand. "And that's our driveway." But Karen, as we would come to know her, wasn't the kind of woman who backed off easily. No, she was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, the type who weaponized rules like they were legal statutes, who thought her laminated badge held more weight than a real one. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing, and the officers approached with caution like we were some kind of threat. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle," one of them said, eyes scanning the driveway like it was a crime scene. My wife remained calm, reaching into her coat to reveal her FBI credentials with the smooth precision of someone trained to de-escalate federal threats, not neighborhood drama. The officer's demeanor shifted instantly, their hands retreating from their belts, their postures loosening. "Ma'am," one of them nodded respectfully. "We didn't realize." Karen, who had been standing smugly to the side, arms crossed, paled like she'd seen a ghost. You're with the FBI," she stammered, the confidence draining from her voice. "Why didn't you say something?" My wife simply looked at her and said, "You didn't ask." That should have been the end of it. But for Karen, humiliation was fuel. The next morning, we found a bright orange violation notice taped to our door with language that seemed far too aggressive for what they claimed was a community-friendly reminder. It accused us of violating Code 3.4b, improper parking of commercial or government vehicles, and threatened daily fines if the SUV remained in view. We laughed it off at first, assuming it was an empty threat. But the notices kept coming, each more aggressive than the last. When I went to speak to a neighbor about it, he looked over his shoulder before whispering, "She's done this before." To the paramedic who used to live in Lot 7. And the schoolteacher who parked her bus for one night. "You're not the first target, just the newest." That's when we started noticing the cameras. Small, barely visible security cams disguised in birdhouses and lawn lights. New installations pointed directly at our property. My wife's instincts kicked in. She spent the next evening walking the perimeter with a detection device she used in fieldwork. "They're not HOA issued," she said after sweeping the area. "Some of these are privately operated. Wireless. Whoever set them up has remote access." That raised red flags, even for a woman used to surveilling cartel operations. She began documenting everything, every notice, every strange occurrence, every car that slowed in front of our home. Meanwhile, I filed a formal complaint with the HOA, only to receive a curt reply that Karen had full authority to enforce regulations and that further violations would be met with consequences. We were being boxed in, provoked, pushed to either conform or leave. But they didn't know who they were messing with. My wife called in a favor to a former colleague in Bureau Intelligence. Within a day, she had a dossier on the HOA's board members. What she found was damning. Karen had a history of filing frivolous police reports. The treasurer had 3 bankruptcy filings and was flagged in a suspicious money transfer involving a fake landscaping business. The secretary had changed their name 3 times and had sealed records in 2 other counties. "This is bigger than some petty neighborhood drama," my wife said, scrolling through pages of financial documents. "There's fraud here. And a possible money laundering scheme." Still, she didn't go public with it. She watched. She waited. She continued to gather information quietly, like she was back in Quantico. Then came the night someone tried to break into our garage. We heard the alarm blare and rushed outside, only to see a figure darting through the side gate. The footage from our own security system showed a man in a hoodie trying to cut the power box before running when the lights came on. We sent it to the police, who wrote it off as possibly unrelated. Karen, when asked by officers if she'd seen anything, said she was asleep. We knew better. My wife had had enough. The following day, she showed up to the HOA's monthly board meeting uninvited and unannounced, wearing her full FBI field agent suit. The room went silent. Karen's face turned beet red. "You're not allowed to be here," she hissed. "This is private." "Actually," my wife replied, pulling out a letter of legal clarification, "these meetings are subject to state sunshine laws. And as a resident, I have every right to attend." She sat down, stared directly at Karen, and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. When Karen began discussing fines and enforcement policies, my wife calmly asked to review the budget allocations. "Why was $18,000 paid to a contractor that doesn't exist on the Secretary of State's registry?" she asked. The room shifted. One of the other board members, an older man with trembling hands, muttered, "I told you this would come back to bite us." Karen tried to redirect, but it was too late. Whispers filled the room. A neighbor named Cynthia leaned over to us afterward and passed a folded piece of paper into my wife's hand. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered before walking away. It was a list of HOA board purchases unapproved, inflated, and marked with initials. The whole operation was rotten. And the FBI now had an official reason to investigate. That night, my wife filed an official report, coded discreetly to avoid alerting local gossip. She initiated a quiet inquiry through a federal task force specializing in public corruption. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She had a contractor tow our SUV from our driveway, yes, our private property, claiming community safety. We got it back with scratches and dents. That was the final straw. The next day, my wife handed over a dossier to her supervisor. It included recordings, paper trails, financial inconsistencies, and an affidavit from the neighbor who had been fined $500 for unauthorized porch lighting. By the end of the week, an internal memo had reached local law enforcement warning of an impending federal probe. The same cops who had once answered Karen's every call were now backing off, clearly wary of getting caught in the crosshairs. Karen didn't realize it yet, but she'd declared war on a woman trained to dismantle criminal networks and bring down entire international syndicates. And she'd done it over a parking space. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. My wife installed new cameras, began working from home under protective protocols, and assigned a bureau tech team to monitor digital traffic through the HOA's shared servers. "They're not just hiding something," she told me one night. "They're operating something." When I asked what she meant, she showed me a map, lines connecting Karen, the fake contractor, a local bank flagged in a separate federal case, and offshore shell companies. "It's all connected," she said. "And now it's personal." The story of the SUV wasn't about a car, or a driveway, or even a rule violation. It was about control, corruption, and the lengths people will go to maintain power. And as I looked out the window that evening, watching Karen's porch light flicker in the wind, the next few days were a blend of fake smiles, veiled threats, and silent glares as the neighborhood's mood shifted noticeably, not just because my wife had dropped the FBI badge like a hammer on Karen's little kingdom, but because word had already begun spreading like wildfire that the HOA president's usual methods might not be tolerated much longer. What started as gossip between fence-line chats turned into hushed conversations at mailbox corners, the kind where neighbors looked over their shoulders before whispering, "I saw what she did to the ENT family too," or "They fined Mrs. Green for putting a birdbath in her yard, said it was a pest hazard." My wife kept working in the shadows, refusing to react emotionally, documenting everything with the kind of discipline drilled into her during years of covert operations, while Karen, unaware of just how deep the storm she'd awakened really ran, began doubling down. Every day brought a new violation slip, an email, a photo, or even an anonymous report claiming our SUV blocked the street view or that the FBI was intimidating neighbors, none of which had any legal basis but all of which were intended to provoke. We knew this wasn't just about rules anymore, this was psychological warfare, the suburban version of enemy reconnaissance, except the enemy didn't realize she was being surveilled back. Karen's first real mistake came when she installed an unapproved surveillance camera directly across from our home, hidden in a fake tree stump on the community's sidewalk median. The footage fed to a private server that, according to what my wife's tech team found, bounced through multiple proxy locations before landing on a secure encrypted platform usually reserved for private investigative services or black market surveillance brokers. That discovery turned a simmering internal inquiry into a full-blown task force investigation. It was now no longer just a territorial dispute, it had become a suspected civil rights violation layered over what looked like community-level organized corruption. My wife submitted the evidence chain through the proper DOJ channels while keeping her identity low profile in federal documents to avoid tipping off Karen or anyone else on the HOA board. We kept the outward appearance of being just another couple dealing with an overzealous HOA president, but beneath that surface, an entire digital dragnet was unfolding. One that traced suspicious wire transfers, metadata from complaint emails that weren't sent from Karen's home IP address, and a handful of altered city planning documents that tied back to a construction firm bidding for HOA contracts under 3 different names. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder, hosting emergency HOA meetings without notifying residents, all in attempts to push new fines and procedural changes that would give her even more unchecked power. But what she didn't know was that 2 of those meetings were being live-streamed by a brave board member named Alan who had grown tired of being forced to rubber-stamp decisions that reeked of fraud. Alan reached out to my wife through a burner Gmail he created just for the occasion. In the videos, Karen openly discussed installing community-wide key fob entry systems, citing security, but the real plan was to charge residents $250 per home for a new digital lock system provided by, you guessed it, her cousin's shell company. My wife forwarded the stream to a special branch of the FBI's Public Sector Corruption Unit, and within 48 hours, they greenlit Preliminary Investigative Authority for Project Olive, the codename she assigned to the ongoing operation. While all this was happening behind the scenes, Karen continued her charade, handing out citations for everything from faded fence paint to unauthorized recycling bins, even going as far as to threaten a retired veteran down the street for flying an American flag on a pole slightly taller than allowed. Her reign of petty terror wasn't new, just more exposed now, and the more she felt it slipping away, the more erratic her behavior became. She started having secret meetings with her vice president in the clubhouse after midnight, and on one occasion was seen removing physical files from the HOA office with gloves on. Little did she know the clubhouse camera, the one she forgot to replace, was already feeding real-time footage straight into my wife's secure bureau server. I watched one of those clips in disbelief as Karen fumbled with a stack of documents marked historical violations, stuffing them into a duffel bag like a scene from a low-budget crime drama. My wife didn't flinch. She'd seen cartel leaders act more composed under pressure. She used that very footage to get a sealed approval to begin pulling HOA financial records directly from the state-mandated database, where she found dozens of forged digital signatures, including mine, apparently used to authorize community-wide architectural modifications, something I'd never seen or approved. This opened the door to local charges of document tampering and identity fraud, but my wife wasn't ready to strike just yet. Instead, she continued applying pressure, carefully timed FOIA requests, anonymous legal notices challenging HOA overreach, and meetings with local county officials to quietly alert them of what was bubbling under the surface. Karen, meanwhile, began to unravel. Her tone in HOA emails shifted from smug and condescending to outright paranoid. Enemies within the community, she wrote in one memo, are trying to destabilize neighborhood unity through intimidation and false claims. She started accusing random residents of being spies for government entities, not knowing how close to the truth she actually was. The final spark came when she attempted to shut down a community fundraiser for a local animal shelter, citing non-compliance with HOA scheduled events. That act drew the ire of nearly every dog-loving neighbor and even prompted one elderly resident to shout at her, "You're not Queen Karen, this is still America." That viral clip made its way to social media, adding unwanted attention to the HOA's already suspicious reputation. At the same time, my wife received a tip from an internal bureau mole who flagged that Karen had attempted to run a background check on us through an unauthorized channel, possibly by bribing someone inside a third-party private security firm used by the HOA. That act alone was grounds for federal wire fraud and unauthorized surveillance charges. With the evidence stacking up and the board splintering from internal distrust, my wife finally met with the head of the regional FBI division to present the full scope of the corruption, citing stolen funds, rigged contracts, personal data breaches, document fraud, and retaliation against government employees. The director approved the next phase, a covert audit involving a shell buyer posing as a real estate investor looking to purchase 3 homes inside the neighborhood to monitor HOA communications, spending, and internal operations. While that played out quietly, my wife orchestrated one more trap. She attended the next HOA meeting again, this time with legal observers, and asked to see the formal accounting reports. Karen refused, saying the documents were classified by executive board privilege, a phrase so legally absurd the observers nearly laughed out loud. What Karen didn't know was that withholding such financials from paying residents is a violation of multiple state transparency laws. That moment, as small as it seemed, was enough to lock in the final legal justification needed for a coordinated takedown. The next 48 hours were silent, but deadly. Neighbors noticed 3 unfamiliar SUVs parked near the clubhouse and unmarked men in business attire strolling the sidewalks with clipboards and cameras. Karen must have sensed something was wrong because she skipped the next meeting, locked her social media, and was last seen loading several hard drives into her car late at night. But by then, it was too late. My wife had already set the dominoes in motion. The woman who tried to police a driveway was now under surveillance so deep it would have made a mafia boss sweat. And this suburban nightmare was only just getting started. The morning after Karen's paranoia hit a fever pitch, with her skipping the HOA meeting and locking down all forms of communication, my wife sat silently at our kitchen counter, reviewing printouts of email headers and payment ledgers that showed gross misuse of HOA funds, everything from fake landscaping consultations to tech upgrades billed by non-existent companies, and I could see it in her eyes. The line had been crossed, and she was done playing quiet observer. She picked up her encrypted work phone, the one only used for internal agency matters, dialed a number from memory, and without emotion said, "Activate dormant flag on all of HOA, requesting fast-track validation for suspected fraud, financial abuse, and potential civil liberty violations under residential governance." On the other end, her longtime contact at the Bureau, Special Agent Diana Moffat, didn't ask any questions, just said, "Send me what you have." Within 15 minutes, we had initiated a low-key task force activation under a domestic policy clause rarely used, federal response to abuse of power by local governing bodies in non-governmental institutions. Most Americans don't even know it exists because it's only triggered when HOA boards cross the line into personal surveillance. Retaliation against government officials, or when funds meant for community development start mysteriously disappearing. The evidence we had collected over the last 2 weeks, Karen's illegal camera setups, falsified signatures on financial authorizations, her bribery attempt for a background check on a federal agent, and even an audio clip from a whistleblower on the board, created a slam-dunk case for something far more serious than HOA drama. It was now officially a federal financial crimes investigation. My wife packaged everything into a digital dossier, encrypted with triple-layer authentication, and uploaded it to the FBI's internal cloud where it would be verified by Bureau forensics analysts within 72 hours. Meanwhile, Karen, oblivious that the walls were closing in, decided to escalate her attacks in what would become the most ill-advised move yet. She filed a formal harassment complaint against my wife with the county, falsely accusing her of intimidating residents using federal authority, attaching doctored screenshots and staged photos that look like they were pulled straight out of a Lifetime movie villain playbook. This, ironically, was her fatal mistake. That report crossed desks at the local PD and, by protocol, was forwarded to federal oversight because it involved a government official. Within hours, not only was the claim debunked thanks to timestamped footage and metadata, but it officially opened Karen to charges of filing a false report against a federal agent, which carries a prison sentence and immediate criminal review. The county officer assigned to process the report called my wife personally, confused. "Ma'am, why would someone accuse you of weaponizing an HOA?" My wife replied calmly, "That's what I'm trying to find out too." But the damage to Karen's side was already spreading. 2 board members resigned within a day, one citing moral reasons, the other simply dropping off his key at the HOA office and disappearing from the group chat without a word. My wife's FBI contacts confirmed internal subpoenas had been issued to the HOA's bank, their contracted law firm, and the city zoning office. Meanwhile, Ellen, the same board member who had quietly leaked Karen's secret meetings, began cooperating more openly, feeding us scanned minutes from emergency HOA meetings never disclosed to residents, many of which contained Karen's signature on proposals that never passed a vote. One such document approved the $48,000 landscaping renovation budget, though the yard remained untouched. The contractor listed? a dissolved LLC tied to Karen's sister-in-law. At the same time, Agent Moffat's forensic team uncovered that several residents had been hit with unexplained fees directly deducted via autopaid money that vanished from HOA accounts before any record was made. It was an embezzlement network hiding behind rulebooks, and the HOA board, intentionally or not, was being used to funnel thousands from unsuspecting families. Karen's emails, uncovered through legal federal request, revealed she was pushing through a neighborhood beautification fee that didn't legally exist but was worded vaguely enough to seem valid. The plan was to roll it out slowly, $20 here, $35 there, to all residents, then sweep the profits into a shadow account under the board's discretionary fund. But she had no idea she was being watched now. My wife coordinated with forensic accountants to trace the shell accounts, and what they found made even her pause: multiple offshore transactions routed through dummy nonprofits in Nevada, then redirected to the Cayman Islands. We weren't just dealing with HOA nonsense anymore, this was organized white-collar crime, and Karen, with all her petty fines and power plays, was about to learn that when you poke a federal agent, the whole government might just poke back. Yet even then, my wife didn't retaliate personally. She followed protocol, built the case quietly, and stayed steps ahead. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior became more erratic. One night, we spotted her standing across the street, staring at our house, not moving for several minutes. I recorded it, just in case, while my wife updated the bureau security team. They flagged it as possible soft surveillance, a tactic used when suspects try to assess whether they're being monitored. Karen was starting to suspect something, but she had no idea just how deep we'd gone. My wife's team coordinated with the IRS Criminal Division to compare financial records, and sure enough, discrepancies appeared in her annual filings: undisclosed assets, sudden cash infusions, and even a fraudulent deduction listed as community development expenses. At the same time, more neighbors began stepping forward, emboldened by the rumors that Karen's reign was nearing collapse. One elderly couple shared how Karen had charged them $700 for painting their porch the wrong shade of beige, while another neighbor revealed she'd been threatened with foreclosure if she didn't remove a backyard swing set for safety code violation. These stories helped build a larger case for coercion under the RICO clause, yes, the same law used to take down mob families. Karen had turned a neighborhood into her personal empire, and now the Bureau was coming for it. Meanwhile, she tried one last desperate move, mailing out a community-wide letter claiming our family was under federal investigation and urging residents to sign a petition for our removal. That backfired immediately. Not only was it legally baseless, but it constituted public defamation against a federal agent, no less. My wife forwarded the letter to the Department of Justice and added it to the list of evidence. At this point, the case had evolved so drastically, it was pulled from the local FBI office and rerouted to a Washington, D.C. task force for formal review. Karen, still clueless about the scale of her own disaster, was throwing matches into a gasoline-soaked house. Karen's emails, uncovered through legal federal request, revealed she was pushing through a neighborhood beautification fee that didn't legally exist but was worded vaguely enough to seem valid. The plan was to roll it out slowly, $20 here, $35 there, to all residents, then sweep the profits into a shadow account under the board's discretionary fund. But she had no idea she was being watched now. My wife coordinated with forensic accountants to trace the shell accounts, and what they found made even her pause: multiple offshore transactions routed through dummy nonprofits in Nevada, then redirected to the Cayman Islands. We weren't just dealing with HOA nonsense anymore, this was organized white-collar crime, and Karen, with all her petty fines and power plays, was about to learn that when you poke a federal agent, the whole government might just poke back. Yet even then, my wife didn't retaliate personally. She followed protocol, built the case quietly, and stayed steps ahead. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior became more erratic. One night, we spotted her standing across the street, staring at our house, not moving for several minutes. I recorded it, just in case, while my wife updated the bureau security team. They flagged it as possible soft surveillance, a tactic used when suspects try to assess whether they're being monitored. Karen was starting to suspect something, but she had no idea just how deep we'd gone. My wife's team coordinated with the IRS Criminal Division to compare financial records, and sure enough, discrepancies appeared in her annual filings: undisclosed assets, sudden cash infusions, and even a fraudulent deduction listed as community development expenses. At the same time, more neighbors began stepping forward, emboldened by the rumors that Karen's reign was nearing collapse. One elderly couple shared how Karen had charged them $700 for painting their porch the wrong shade of beige, while another neighbor revealed she'd been threatened with foreclosure if she didn't remove a backyard swing set for safety code violation. These stories helped build a larger case for coercion under the RICO clause. Yes, the same law used to take down mob families. Karen had turned a neighborhood into her personal empire, and now the Bureau was coming for it. Meanwhile, she tried one last desperate move, mailing out a community-wide letter claiming our family was under federal investigation and urging residents to sign a petition for our removal. That backfired immediately. Not only was it legally baseless, but it constituted public defamation against a federal agent, no less. My wife forwarded the letter to the Department of Justice and added it to the list of evidence. At this point, the case had evolved so drastically, it was pulled from the local FBI office and rerouted to a Washington, D.C. task force for formal review. Karen, still clueless about the scale of her own disaster, was throwing matches into a gasoline-soaked house. Profiting from fabricated HOA fines solidified the legal theory that this wasn't just mismanagement, it was racketeering. My wife, now serving as the formal liaison between the investigation and DOJ's public corruption wing, drafted the internal summary that would be presented for indictment consideration, and the depth of it was staggering: over $210,000 in misallocated HOA funds, 14 separate contractor fraud cases, 9 resident complaints ignored due to personal retaliation, and at least 3 confirmed instances of surveillance data being sold to private third parties without consent. Still, Karen strutted around the community as if she were untouchable, barking orders at teenagers riding bikes, slapping citations on houses with political signs she disagreed with, and even trying to tow a veteran's pickup truck for being unsightly. But her power was a paper crown, and my wife was about to burn it to ash. She made one final play. Attending the next HOA meeting not as a neighbor, but as a federal agent, badge clipped to her hip, legal folder in hand. When Karen saw her walk in, the color drained from her face so fast she looked medically compromised. "This is a private meeting," she snapped, clutching the agenda like a shield. "Not anymore," my wife replied, placing a digital recorder on the table. "You've officially violated 4 state codes and 3 federal statutes. This meeting is now being observed under legal oversight." You could hear a pin drop. Neighbors leaned forward, stunned. A board member visibly trembled as he whispered, "She's FBI," and my wife just nodded once, then began to read dates, figures, testimony summaries, digital evidence chains, financial transfers, all laid out in bulletproof clarity. Karen tried to interject, but my wife stopped her cold. "You can remain silent. That would be wise." Karen bolted from the room 10 minutes later, her phone glued to her ear as she frantically tried calling someone who, I imagine, was no longer answering. The very next morning, residents woke to find official-looking vehicles parked near the clubhouse and plainclothes agents taking photos, reviewing documents, and conducting brief interviews with anyone willing to talk. The community forum was on fire, posts flying in with subject lines like "Karen under investigation" and "Who's the woman in the suit?" People we hadn't even met were now walking their dogs past our house just to bump into us and ask questions. "Are you really FBI? Did she break the law? Is the HOA going away?" My wife answered each one with the same calm response: "We're protecting your rights. That's all you need to know." And just like that, the tide began to turn. Residents who'd once been silent began stepping up, recounting stories of bizarre late-night visits from Karen, emails threatening liens, threats over holiday decorations, and accusations of non-compliance over things like rose bushes being too bushy. One neighbor, a retired judge, revealed that he had been fined $1,200 for unapproved structural changes after installing a small side deck, something well within the property code but apparently a trigger for Karen's vendetta after he refused to endorse her last election bid. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. Karen had been running the HOA like a petty dictatorship for years, targeting residents who didn't bow to her authority and draining funds into personal pet projects disguised as community improvements. And now, with federal agents collecting affidavits and financial auditors combing through every ledger, there was nowhere left for her to hide. That night, my wife received a confidential email: Department of Justice approval for preliminary charges pending a grand jury decision. We were in the final stretch. The next HOA board meeting would be the last Karen ever attended in her official capacity. My wife prepared her closing package, the document that would be handed off to the U.S. Attorney's office, complete with timestamps, resident testimonies, and forensic account summaries. As she reviewed it, she looked up and said, "You know what's crazy? This all started because she didn't like my parking spot." I smiled, because it was true. One driveway violation had become the thread that unraveled an empire built on intimidation, greed, and deception. And now, as the neighborhood watched the calm before the storm, no one suspected that within days, the queen of the HOA would be wearing handcuffs, not a clipboard. My wife didn't need to shout. She didn't need to fight. She just followed the law, and in doing so, brought justice to a neighborhood that had forgotten what that word even meant. It was a strangely quiet Thursday morning when the familiar whine of patrol car tires rolled back into the neighborhood. Two cruisers pulling up not far from our driveway, parking with calculated caution, as if the officers knew full well what kind of powder keg they were stepping into, but this time, their arrival wasn't because of a false HOA report or Karen's hysterical rule enforcement. It was because something had shifted at the local precinct, and they had just received an interagency notification flagging this neighborhood as an active federal zone under surveillance due to ongoing corruption. Investigations initiated by none other than the woman Karen had tried so hard to run out with her clipboard and fake citations. The two officers exited their vehicles calmly, no longer with suspicion in their posture, but with curiosity, both recognizing my wife from the first confrontation and greeting her this time with respect, not hostility. "Commander," one of them said, nodding in acknowledgement, his tone completely different than before, "we just wanted to let you know we got the memo." And frankly, we had no idea how deep this went. My wife nodded politely, thanked them for the update, and asked if they'd had any direct contact with Karen in the last 24 hours. "She tried to file a complaint again last night," the officer admitted with a sigh, "said someone in your house was targeting her. We logged it, but we knew it was bogus." Karen, it seemed, still hadn't figured out that every step she took was now logged, traced, and potentially criminal. But even as the law finally began leaning away from her side, she wasn't done stirring chaos. That same afternoon, she marched through the neighborhood passing out another round of printed flyers, this time warning residents that an internal coup was being led by federal agents with personal vendettas, and she encouraged neighbors to refuse cooperation with outsiders trying to dismantle our community. It was desperate, paranoid, and laughably ironic, because in her attempt to paint herself as the victim, Karen only succeeded in digging the hole deeper. One of the flyers landed on the porch of a family whose teenage son was in the same agency program my wife helped establish, and they immediately called to inform her. "She's accusing you of being a domestic enemy," the mom said, half laughing, half scared. But instead of reacting with anger, my wife did something Karen never could. She stayed disciplined. That evening, she filed an official addendum to the case, submitting Karen's flyers as evidence of public defamation and obstruction of a federal investigation, which upped the stakes significantly. By now, federal agents had already gathered 92 pieces of admissible evidence, video footage, bank statements, email headers, invoice trails, altered PDFs with metadata proving falsification, and resident testimonies including notarized statements from victims who had been fined, stalked, or financially threatened by Karen. But this next piece, the flyers, was important because it showed intent. A desperate attempt to manipulate public opinion and tamper with witnesses, which is exactly what the DOJ needed to greenlight the final operation. On Friday, as the sun rose behind the identical rooftops of our cul-de-sac, four black government vehicles pulled into the neighborhood at the exact moment Karen was walking her dog, still trying to act like she ran the block. The timing wasn't accidental. It was psychological. She froze mid-stride, eyes narrowing as two of the suited agents approached her. "Ma'am," one began, "we have a few questions about recent HOA decisions and financial documentation you've signed over the past year." Karen, true to form, tried to puff up. "Who do you think you are?" she barked, stepping back, dog leash shaking in her grip. That's when my wife walked out onto our porch calm, clipboard in hand, with a sealed folder stamped with a federal emblem. "They're with me," she said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "And you're going to want a lawyer." Karen's eyes locked on her like she'd seen a ghost, or more precisely, the ghost of every abuse of power she'd ever committed now coming back to haunt her. The agents didn't handcuff her that morning. No, they let her stew. Let her feel the power drain from her grasp inch by inch. Instead, they served her with a formal notice of intent to investigate under federal anti-corruption statutes and notified her that her access to HOA funds, offices, and documentation systems was officially revoked pending legal review. The news spread like wildfire. Residents stood outside with their morning coffee, whispering, watching, some even cheering silently as Karen stumbled back into her house pale, sweaty, and visibly shaking. But the real storm hit later that afternoon when local law enforcement, now fully looped into the operation, served Karen with a court summons and search warrant. Her home, which she once used to intimidate others with HOA parties and policy meetings, was now the site of an active evidence recovery. Agents left with 2 laptops, 3 boxes of financial records, and a flash drive she had tried to throw in the trash. Only it had been planted with a GPS tracker earlier that week. As the search continued, neighbors began telling stories publicly, on the community forum, on social media, even to local reporters who caught wind of the action. She told me my daughter's wheelchair ramp was a code violation, one resident said during a televised interview. Said it made the house look unappealing. But I built it because my girl's in physical therapy. And now we find out she was stealing from us all along? The outrage was immediate. A group of residents gathered and filed an emergency motion to suspend the current HOA leadership and requested oversight by a temporary state administrator, a motion that was approved within 24 hours thanks to mounting legal pressure. Karen's empire crumbled faster than anyone imagined. Within 48 hours, her bank accounts were frozen, her credentials were pulled, and her face, once known for snide remarks and threatening letters, was now featured in local news coverage under the headline HOA President Investigated by FBI for Alleged Corruption and Abuse of Power. But the best moment came the following Monday, when Karen tried to sneak out of her house with a suitcase, thinking she'd leave town before anything stuck, only to be met by 2 agents waiting at the end of her driveway. Miss Turner, one said, "Yes, we finally learned her last name. You are under federal detainment for questioning. Please come with us." No cuffs. No drama. Just a slow, humiliating walk to the vehicle while neighbors recorded from porches, sending the footage viral before dinner. Inside our home, my wife watched it all without a grin, without gloating, just quiet, measured satisfaction. Justice isn't about humiliation, she told me. It's about accountability. And she's finally got it coming. The same officers who once arrived ready to arrest my wife for parking in her own driveway were now part of the machine bringing her harasser down. Karen picked the wrong woman to target. And now, the cops she once used as pawns were saluting the very woman she tried to silence. Once Karen had been formally detained for questioning in the neighborhood finally began breathing without her oppressive presence looming behind blinds and bulletin boards, my wife kicked off the most calculated and damning phase of the entire investigation, Operation Papergate, a multi-agency, interdepartmental deep dive into the HOA's records, finances, correspondence, surveillance policies, and anything else that could connect the dots between Karen's abuses of power and the systems that silently supported her. While neighbors were still reeling from the shock of watching their HOA president hauled off in a black Suburban, my wife was already on the phone coordinating with federal financial crime analysts, IRS auditors, and data forensic teams to begin cataloging everything Karen had touched since she first took power. Our living room transformed overnight into a quiet war room. Files, scanned documents, posted notes, printouts of altered meeting minutes, and at the center of it all was a whiteboard web of arrows linking shell companies, board members, shady contractors, and property tax discrepancies so convoluted that even veteran accountants needed second passes. It didn't take long for the evidence to become undeniable. Karen had spent the last 6 years funneling HOA dues into community development funds that were never used for actual improvements but instead rerouted through cutout vendors that never performed work, most of which were registered under different aliases tied to her relatives, including one LLC owned by her ex-husband in another state and another listed under a cousin's deceased father-in-law. Fake emails between board members approving these contracts were matched against phone metadata showing no contact had ever occurred between them, and payment logs revealed invoices for projects that had never even been proposed publicly, let alone voted on. Even more chilling, some records showed personal data, license plates, driver's license numbers, and home layouts were collected by Karen under the guise of neighborhood security updates and quietly sold to a third-party security firm that had recently been flagged by the FTC for unauthorized data harvesting. That single discovery kicked the investigation into overdrive, triggering new departments to get involved, including the Cyber Division and Department of Consumer Protection. Karen hadn't just broken financial laws, she'd violated privacy acts, falsified government-adjacent documents, and may have even crossed state lines with fraudulent intent, elevating the case to the level of a full federal indictment. As all this unfolded, the temporary HOA oversight board installed by the county reached out to my wife and asked her to participate in an open forum to explain what was going on to the community. She agreed under one condition, that the meeting be recorded, archived, and distributed to every resident. That evening, more than 200 people filled the community center, some standing in doorways and windows just to hear what the woman Karen tried to destroy had to say. My wife stepped up to the podium, calm and professional, and began with one sentence that echoed across the room. What happened here wasn't just illegal, it was deliberate, organized, and predatory. She then spent the next hour walking them through what had occurred: fake fines issued to cover embezzlement gaps, surveillance equipment installed without consent, fraudulent board approvals, elderly residents tricked into signing documents they couldn't understand, and even kickbacks disguised as special assessments for fake maintenance projects. Screenshots of falsified receipts were projected on a screen. Voicemail recordings of Karen threatening homeowners were played aloud. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs, then by people raising their hands to ask if they, too, had been victims. One by one, stories came forward: a widowed teacher fined for leaving a porch light on, a family charged for repainting their house using the wrong shade of cream, a disabled vet told he'd be sued if he didn't remove his ADA-compliant handrail. It was overwhelming, but also cathartic. The community wasn't just angry, they were ashamed they'd been asleep while this happened under their noses. But instead of outrage, my wife offered something better: resolution. She informed them that restitution was already being calculated, that the fraudulent charges were being reversed, and that the Department of Housing and Urban Development was issuing a recommendation to federally restrict Karen and any of her known accomplices from holding any HOA or community board position for life. Cheers erupted. Some people wept. Others just shook their heads in stunned silence. After the meeting, a quiet line formed of people waiting to thank my wife, not just for what she'd done, but for how she'd done it, legally, ethically, without ever raising her voice or stepping outside the law. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Operation Papergate was wrapping up its final stage: asset recovery. Bank accounts tied to Karen's fraudulent LLCs were frozen. Properties in her name, purchased using laundered funds, were flagged and seized. The IRS issued liens. The state initiated proceedings to permanently revoke her business licenses. The FBI worked with the DOJ to prepare a public report summarizing the operation's findings, which would later become the subject of a case study in federal training academies for how to dismantle white-collar corruption at the neighborhood level. But even with all the victories, my wife stayed grounded. She never gloated. Never took a victory lap. She simply organized her final report, made sure every victim got connected with recovery programs or legal support, and quietly packed up the folders she'd kept in our dining room for weeks. "It's not about crushing people," she said to me late one night, sipping her tea on the porch as cicadas buzzed around us. "It's about showing them that the law still means something and that people in power are accountable." And just like that, the neighborhood, once silenced by fear, was louder than ever with pride, unity, and the echoes of a woman who stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by a clipboard tyrant who thought she was untouchable. Karen underestimated one thing: that the woman she tried to bully wasn't just any wife in any driveway. She was an FBI commander with the law on her side and justice in her blood. It was poetic, really. The way everything finally collapsed on the woman who had once strutted around with a clipboard like she was royalty, now pacing nervously in a holding cell while the case she had so foolishly triggered unfolded around her like a meticulously choreographed trap. Every lie she told, every dollar she stole, every rule she twisted, cataloged, archived, and now weaponized through the full might of federal prosecution. The morning of the official takedown was almost anticlimactic in its calm. There were no sirens, no helicopters, no SWAT teams in camouflage, just a silent convoy of black Suburbans moving through the gates of our HOA, IDs flashing, agents in neatly pressed suits, briefcases clutched, eyes scanning, not for violence, but for documentation, evidence, accountability. My wife stood at the front of it all, dressed in a navy blue suit that carried more authority than any HOA badge ever could, flanked by agents from the DOJ's Office of Public Corruption and 2 forensic analysts who had spent the last several weeks dissecting Karen's digital paper trail with surgical precision. The operation had a simple objective: serve formal indictments to all complicit board members, seize relevant evidence, and present the community with the findings in a public forum to ensure transparency, a concept Karen had fought so hard to bury. The first stop was the HOA office, where agents entered quietly and presented warrants to the interim board, who had already been briefed and agreed to cooperate. Then they moved to the private homes of the remaining corrupted board members, none of whom had the foresight to lawyer up, still thinking this was some petty civil dispute rather than the legal iceberg barreling toward them. When Karen was finally transferred from holding to a federal processing center, she wasn't yelling or denying or even bargaining. She was silent, shell-shocked, broken in a way only someone who believed they were untouchable could be. She now faced 13 charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, racketeering, obstruction of justice, falsifying documents, civil rights violations, and misappropriation of community funds, a legal smorgasbord that could put her away for decades. Meanwhile, my wife met with a U.S. attorney to finalize the presentation of evidence that would be submitted to the grand jury. She wasn't nervous, this was what she did. She explained everything with the precision of someone who'd spent her career navigating the deepest waters of interagency investigations. Every quote was attributed. Every file had a hash-matched copy. Every transaction had a timestamp and witness. The prosecution team, normally a skeptical and hardened group, sat in stunned silence as she laid out the final timeline, from the first HOA fine over our driveway, to the forged contracts, to the illegal data sales, to the attempted retaliation against a federal officer. When the lead prosecutor finally spoke, he just said, "This is airtight. She's finished." But the true climax came during the community-wide town hall, held in the local school auditorium, packed shoulder to shoulder with residents who once feared HOA retaliation but now wore t-shirts that read "No one's above the law." My wife stepped onto the stage not as a neighbor, not even as just an FBI commander, but as the reason every one of them could now sleep without wondering if a notice, a lien, or a threat would show up in their mailbox the next morning. The crowd rose in a standing ovation before she even spoke. And when she did, it wasn't to gloat, it was to educate. She walked through the charges, explained the steps of restitution, and told the community exactly what safeguards would be put in place to ensure nothing like this would ever happen again. Residents had the opportunity to ask questions, some tearfully thanking her for saving their homes, others asking how they could contribute to future oversight. My wife made one final promise on that stage: you don't need fear to have order. You need fairness. You need transparency. You need truth. And just like that, the reign of Karen was not just over, it was obliterated, atomized by the very institution she once tried to manipulate for her own ego. And in the days that followed, the story went national. FBI commander exposes Suburban HOA crime ring became a trending headline across major news outlets, and my wife's phone buzzed for days with interview requests, offers to write a book, even political invitations. She ignored them all. This wasn't for fame, she told me. It was for every person who paid their dues and got silence in return. It was for everyone who lost money, who lost peace, who lost sleep because someone like her abused a little bit of power. She submitted her final report to the Bureau, thanked the task force agents personally, and went right back to her normal routine: coffee at 6 a.m., jog at 7, briefing call by 8, like nothing had happened. But something had. A whole neighborhood was safe again. Not because of a bigger fence or a stronger HOA, but because one woman dared to park her SUV in her own driveway, and when someone came after her for it, she didn't flinch, didn't fold, and didn't fight dirty. She fought smart. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that justice, real justice, doesn't shout. It shows up, does its job, and leaves a legacy behind. In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest and the historic unraveling of the most corrupt HOA our county had ever seen, a quiet transformation swept across the neighborhood, not just physically with the removal of Karen's unauthorized surveillance cameras, bogus violation signs, and the ominous community standards enforcement mailbox she had mounted like a sheriff's badge, but spiritually, as if every home, every porch light, and every mailbox had finally exhaled after years of invisible oppression. The new interim HOA board, carefully vetted and overseen by state compliance officers, was composed of actual residents, a retired judge, a school principal, a nurse, and a veteran who had once been fined for flying a flag that Karen didn't like. Their first act was a community-wide reset, revoking every fine, suspension, and citation issued in the past 5 years and starting from scratch with a transparent budget, open voting systems, and monthly public audits. My wife, while declining all formal leadership roles, agreed to serve as a pro bono advisor to the Oversight Committee, helping them draft a legally sound charter that would permanently strip any future board from having unilateral power, secret meetings, or discretionary authority over residents' private lives. She made sure the new rules were bulletproof, backed by real law, and most importantly, written in plain English, so no one could twist them the way Karen had. Meanwhile, restitution was already being issued, over $180,000 refunded to residents who had been unfairly charged, and more than $300,000 in seized assets from Karen's shell companies earmarked for community repairs and rebuilding efforts, including restoring the neglected community park, repairing the pool that Karen had kept closed for maintenance for over 2 years, and upgrading the shared security gate with a system controlled by residents, not a single tyrant with a keypad. But perhaps the most important shift was cultural. Neighbors who once ignored each other began talking again, sharing stories of how they had all suffered in silence, how they felt ashamed they didn't speak up, and how inspired they were that one woman, one resident, stood her ground and fought not just back, but forward. Children who had been told they couldn't draw with chalk on the sidewalk were now decorating every inch with color and creativity. Veterans who had once been silenced for displaying banners now flew flags proudly from porches without fear. The once silent community forum transformed into a lively bulletin board of shared resources, event planning, and gratitude. And in the center of it all, quietly observing from our porch with a cup of tea and that familiar unreadable expression, was my wife, the same woman Karen had once tried to paint as a menace for simply parking her SUV in her own driveway. Journalists kept calling, major networks asked for exclusive interviews, and even publishing houses offered six-figure book deals, but she refused them all. "I didn't do it for attention," she'd say. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because no one else would." And in those words was a lesson the entire community would never forget, that silence isn't safety, that compliance isn't peace, and that titles like president or commander mean nothing if they aren't backed by integrity. One evening, during the community's first ever HOA appreciation picnic, hosted in the very park Karen had tried to pave over for a dog run, my wife was handed a handmade plaque by a little girl who once saw her mom cry over a lien they couldn't afford. It read, "Thank you for protecting our neighborhood like a hero." My wife knelt down, smiled, and said softly, "I didn't protect it. I just reminded it how to protect itself." And that, more than the headlines, more than the federal victory, more than the broken gavel Karen left behind in the HOA office desk drawer, that was her legacy. She didn't save a neighborhood. She woke it up. And when she finally parked that black SUV in our driveway again, this time with the garage door open, the porch light on, and neighbors waving from every direction, it was clear that the community no longer saw her as an outsider, or even just a federal agent. They saw her for what she really was, the woman who turned a simple act of defiance into a blueprint for justice, and proved once and for all that in a world full of quiet corruption and loud tyrants, sometimes it only takes one parked car and the right woman behind the wheel to change everything.